Hey guys, this is Pablo with Meditation Amsterdam. In today's video, I want to talk about the topic of addiction and how I would argue that our understanding of addiction, because it is based on traditional, or often based on traditional knowledge about psychology, which can be rather mechanistic or technocratic in nature, can land us in a place in which we paint addictions in a bad light and also in a very incomplete kind of way, which ultimately defeats our attempts at having a more wholesome and a more kind and at the same time healthy relationship with our addictions or our bad habits. And perhaps bad habit is a good place to start because we tend to think of addictions, or we tend to equate bad habits with addictions. So to my mind, an addiction is a bad habit in which we compulsively engage. So if we are compulsive about a bad habit, it's an addiction. And if we grant a little bit of extra space, if we compulsively engage in a good habit, it could also be classified as an addiction, such as workaholism, for example, or compulsively donating to charity, let's say, right? You could also classify that as an addiction. And so as a working definition is not too bad. After all, anything that we compulsively engage in starts to have a detrimental effect in our life because it gets in the way of a more balanced way of living. And if that compulsion indeed is tied to a bad habit, then it's going to have a doubly negative effect because of its cumulative impact on our health or our finances or our relationships, right? But see, in looking at addictions on the level of the habit itself, we tend to enter into a contentious relationship with our addictions. We tend to try to fight them on the level of the habit itself. And that can create a lot of guilt, and it can also create a lot of tension because if we go into a battle with our bad habits, we will more often than not lose. And even if we do eliminate one bad habit, we will very quickly see it replaced by another. The reason for this is that, of course, these bad habits are underpinned by something. And, this is no mystery to modern psychology, right? They will tell you that really what's happening is that there are emotional hang-ups or traumas or deficiencies that we have not really dealt with. And in order to escape those and to soothe ourselves, we engage in an addiction. So far, we have not left the territory of common knowledge, right? Good or bad habits, which are compulsive, triggered by emotional things that are not resolved, and which, unless resolved, keep underpinning and triggering us to have a kind of pull or be subject to a sort of longing or I'm looking for a word, it might come to me later, but there is a pull, you could say, towards engaging in these habits. So what's the problem with this view, and what is the the thing that makes it insufficient? Well, I would argue that the that there is something positive about dealing with unresolved hang-ups that underpin our addictions. It is definitely better than just trying to battle the habit head on, right? Like, there's no question about that. Where this does not go far enough is, first of all, it only deals with addictions that are explicit or which are action-based, things that we enact out there in the world. And to my mind, it ignores some of the more internal addictions, such as worrying, overthinking, compulsively desiring certain outcomes, compulsively shunning or trying to avoid other outcomes, compulsive aversion to certain people, places, or circumstances, and compulsive desire for certain others. And even that is still on the surface, because even though it is internal, is not visible. You could say that worry, overthinking, desiring, aversion are more fundamental, more internal addictions. And those, along with the external addictions, are underpinned by a much more fundamental addiction, which is the addiction to what you could call selfing, or the addiction to feel ourselves to be a separate self, and to act as if we are a separate self, and to think and emote and assume on a compulsive basis that we are a separate self. That being the fundamental addiction. And that being the addiction that then underpins all the others, because of the intolerable effect that it has on our state of mind, you could say, or our sense of well-being and wholesomeness or wholeness. Now, it is interesting to see that the compulsion to self is in itself triggered by unresolved karmic tendencies and propensities that are very, very deep in our psyche. These are less psychological in nature, and they are more primal in nature. And unless dealt with at a primal level, they continue to elicit the need to feel or prop ourselves up as if we are a separate individual self. So whenever one of these very primal affects threatens to come to the surface, immediately the psyche springs up and says, I don't want to feel that primal affect. It's unknown to me. It feels as if it is foreign, it is threatening. And in order to control it and to pretend that it's not there, I am going to create a separate self. And that separate self will act in the world. It will be pleasant. It will be assertive. It'll be heroic. It'll act as if it is the protagonist of the story. Or it will be pathetic. It'll be a victim of the circumstances. Whichever form it may take, whether it is overtly yin or yang, whichever flavor it takes, it will enact, the psyche will enact a separate self to distract itself and protect itself from affects that have not been felt, and which it doesn't want to feel, which is not ready to feel. And so that separate self springs from things that are unprocessed and unfelt on a very primal level. But there's a price to pay for that separate self. And the price to pay is that those affects continue to be unfelt and they become the unconscious, which is constantly bubbling up like a sea of magma behind an apparently dormant volcano, which we can intuitively know is still there, very much alive. And not only that, but the sense of separateness that we feel when we enact and identify ourselves with our separate self is utterly intolerable, because it is as if we are cut off from our very home, from the very source of love and connection that the more primal part of ourselves provides. So the moment we start selfing, we feel disconnected, and it's intolerable. It is that intolerable feeling that then prompts us to overthink as an addiction. But notice how overthinking is already a secondary addiction. It prompts us to worry as an addiction. It prompts us to desire for outcomes as an addiction. It prompts us to prop ourselves up as an addiction, or to cast ourselves in the light of a victim as an addiction. And because those secondary addictions have a very dysregulating effect, we then start to spill over into external addictions to try to regulate ourselves through eating chocolate, or endlessly doom scrolling, or becoming a workaholic to overcompensate. You see, so it's kind of a layered cake of external addictions being the outermost layer of that sort of Russian doll of insufficiency and disconnectedness. The next layer being the more internal addictions to overthinking, worrying, and so on. And underpinning those internal layers of addiction, we have the addiction to being a separate self, and to insisting that we must be a separate self. And that addiction to selfing, in turn, propped up by unconquered parts of our unconscious, which contain primal affects that have not been, I don't want to say conquered, maybe processed or digested might be a friendlier word, because it's a collaborative process, of course. It's not that the conscious mind conquers the unconscious. It's rather that the conscious mind eventually surrenders to the unconscious, rather. But without going too much into that part, you can see how dealing with external addictions is very problematic and very surface level. You kill one, another one will arise. And trying to tackle internal, the deeper addictions is also problematic, and it's not dealing with the core of the situation either. We must therefore focus, and this is in line with my previous video about striking at the root. We want to strike at the root of addiction, which is the spurious, the false sense of self, which can only be undermined by rendering it inoperative, or rendering it redundant, as we deal with ever deeper affects, which start with, indeed, emotional hang-ups and traumas and things of the like, and there goes into deeper layers of affects that are much more primal in nature, potentially perinatal, as in prior to birth, in the gestation period of the fetus, and even, if you want to call that past lives, let's call it past lives. But if that offends your logical sensitivities, then let's call it things that are embedded in our genetic makeup, which are indeed inherited from every previous generation, which was rewarded for feeling fearful and jittery, as a mechanism that increased our chances of survival and passing our genetics onwards to the next generation. So we are, in a sense, a genetic outcome of having been cautious and fearful enough to take really good care of ourselves. But therefore that fearful mechanism is very primal and deeply embedded in our genetics. And at some point, that needs to be processed so that we are not always in a state of alert that triggers dysregulation, which in turn needs to be dealt with through self-soothing mechanisms, which may often be not so healthy. Notice how different this is from the most crude approach to addiction, which is trying to simply use discipline to battle that addiction. And how it is a much more kind view than trying to get our act together through force and through feeling that so long as we're engaging in addiction, there's something wrong with us. In this view, addiction is a perfectly natural outcome of trying to self-regulate due to deeper causes, which can be skillfully addressed. And addiction is a form of self-love, of a system that is doing its best to keep itself afloat and regulated. And that system can find better ways of regulating, but ultimately it's not about becoming better at self-regulating. Ultimately, it's about healing and clarifying and metabolizing or digesting the primal affects that make self-regulation necessary in the first place. To this effect, part of the thing that I invite people to do when I work with them is, especially those of us who are trying to resolve emotional or primal affects and we find difficulty feeling them, is to use addiction and to leverage our addictions as ways to clarify what's hiding behind them. And that can be done by the tactic of delaying gratification, even for very short periods of time, so that if we feel the craving was the word that I was looking for earlier. If we feel the craving for eating sugar, for example, or if we feel the craving for doom scrolling, or if we feel the craving to worry, you see, or if we feel the craving to desire a certain outcome of a certain situation, that ought to be the little red flag, or the flag that says you are right now engaging in a coping mechanism. How about you put that worry aside for a moment, or that desire aside for a moment, or you put that chocolate aside for a moment, or your phone, and whether it's for a minute or 5, you try to explore what is it that is bubbling under the surface, prompting you to engage in the addictive behavior. That is very different from being disciplined, because this is now a clarification and an investigation process. So all you do is you withhold for a moment, because when the craving arises, that is a window of opportunity in which the emotional affect that is usually unconscious has reared its little head above water. It's making itself known, and by not engaging in the behavior immediately, you make the most out of that moment in which the volume has been turned up emotionally, so that it may be felt more clearly. That's the objective. The objective is clarification, never battling addiction with discipline. That will never ever work, ever. Okay, willpower is such a scarce resource that it ought to be saved for, open in case of emergency type of situations in which you really need to push as a one-off, not as a way to change behavior. So we explore what things feel like when we don't give into the behavior immediately, and we engage in that exploration systematically as someone who's trying to discover what's behind. That will be already difficult enough. So it may require indeed a bit of discipline to do that. I'm not trying to suggest that this is easy to do. But it is not a battle against oneself, because the addictive part of us is something that's trying to protect us out of love so that we may soothe and regulate. It's not our enemy. It is just oriented in a way that is not very productive. And so we have to respect that, actually, and we have to honor that, and we have to even be reverent of the fact that there's something in us that is keeping us regulated through addiction. And what we want to do is understand why that protector is springing into action rather than battling against it. Because we're trying to find something that feels like ourselves. When a craving arises, you don't say, there is a craving for chocolate in me. What you say is, I want a chocolate. And you will never succeed at battling what feels like I. So what we want to explore is, what is the affect that arises? And equally important, why does it feel like I? Why am I attributing self or identity to that affect or to the root of that craving? If we withdraw or through investigation come to realize that which arises as a craving is not self, if we stop granting it, if we through clarification and investigation stop granting self or identity to the craving, that craving will lose all its power, because now we will see it as something that is just there, but it's not I. Because I'm the one observing it. You see, but that extrication of selfhood from the craving is done through investigation. And this is not a fight at all. As a matter of fact, it's an investigative process to try to understand, why is it that I move my arm towards a chocolate or towards my phone? Is there a power that makes me move my hand towards my phone? And what is that power, and why does it feel like self? So I go and investigate that craving, that pull, and through investigation I come to realize that it is not self, and therefore I have authority whether to move my arm or not. So our longing for freedom from taking action in the face of discomfort needs to start taking root, rather than our desire to beat our craving into submission or beat our addiction into submission. That will never work. It is a longing for understanding how this craving arises and trying to distinguish our sense of identity from the craving itself, which appears to be I want. So I'm not an expert on addiction. I'm also not a trained psychologist, and there may be lots that can be said about addiction, but it seems to me like this is a kinder and more effective way to view this and to dance with this, because once again it is striking at the root of addiction by looking at the core addiction, which is the sense of self and where it springs from. And it's certainly a lengthy exploration. It's a process, but it also, this notion of withdrawing selfhood or identity from the addiction is, to me, something very. It feels more correct. I have great admiration for the 12-step process. I've been looking at the 12 steps. It goes very, very deep. It's a very spiritual process, but I have a problem with saying, say that I was an alcoholic. I have a problem saying my name is Pablo and I am an alcoholic. I don't think that's accurate. I think it's a great start, but I think it's very problematic in the long run. I would rather say, my name is Pablo, and I behave as if I'm convinced that I'm an alcoholic. As if I'm convinced that I'm an alcoholic. Now, this doesn't touch on the chemical elements of that addiction. There may be genetic proclivities to it, and I would definitely pay that its due. So I don't want to minimize chemical imbalances or proclivities that certain people may have. So by all means, let's not go there. But I think there's a long way to go before you draw that conclusion, before you conclude that you are chemically and physically an alcoholic. Because how would you know that that's the case before you have explored the sense of self? Be careful what you attribute self to. I am is the most powerful statement you can make. And if you say I am an alcoholic, you've already put the last nail on the coffin as to I'm stuck with this. I'd rather be able to have a drink whenever I want. And most of the time, that won't be the case and should not be the case. But I think there's something to be explored here at the very least, right? So that's my take on the topic as I understand it today, and it's been playing in my mind. And I've also been inviting people that I work with to suspend the craving for a minute or two as an exploration rather than to try to really use willpower to stop addictions and bad habits. And with that, I would love to hear what you guys make of it. And I'll be back with more videos of this kind soon enough. If you think this is worth liking, sharing, and subscribing, please do so, as others may benefit from the content. And I'll be back pretty soon. Cheerio, and bye-bye.